The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Lighting Controls Podcast. We have another fantastic guest for you today, someone who's been on the show a couple of times now. But before we jump into the conversation, let me just take a minute to remind everyone that today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. We've got all of our episodes, a news feed, a merch store, training opportunities, as well as our council on lighting controls, startup, and integration. A lot of good stuff going on there. So check it out if you haven't already, but also check it out if you have, because there's new stuff every single day. So, but also want to say a big thank you to our sponsor for making this episode possible, MW Connect. You may have known them as McWong in the past, but they are now rebranded as MW Connect. You can find them at mwconnect.us. They have really great resources online, especially pertaining to what we're going to be talking about with Steve Mesh today. But, they've been in the industry for over 40 years now. They just celebrated their 40th anniversary. They've got a lot of implementation in the US ready to support projects that you're involved in, and they want to be that resource that you reach out to ask for assistance on these lighting controls projects, because lighting controls are complicated, and they have award-winning Bluetooth mesh solutions for your projects. So really check them out. I can't say enough good things about them. But until then, let's get into our conversation here with Steve Mesh. Welcome back. Just for those who have not been in, privy to the episodes you've been on, do you mind just giving us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Sure, I would be happy to. I have been in the lighting field since I was Jim Knuckles' student in Parsons School of Design. That was a long time ago. And many people in the lighting field, as you guys probably know, are from that generation. Many worked with Jim, were students of Jim. I also worked with Carol Klein, who was an absolutely amazing designer. So I've been mostly a lighting designer for the past 44 years now. I just actually in February celebrated the 40th anniversary of teaching my very first lighting design class. So I've been at this for a long time. And I've also had some stints working for manufacturers, but also for example, Pacific Gas and Electric. So I've actually been in the industry in different forms. So it's been interesting.
Well, thank you for joining us again. And, having somebody like you who's been in the industry for such a long time, really a deep well of information that we can tap into on a regular basis, which we really appreciate your willingness to kind of jump onto these conversations. And, you've been involved in a lot of educational resources lately. And oddly enough, again, Ron and I don't kind of try to dovetail these or schedule these in any way, but the episode that's coming out before this is on emergency lighting, actually talking about the revision to NEC and UL 924 requirements that were not revised but still have additional information that are required for lighting controls. And you and I were talking recently about actually applying the requirements to project devices. And so, I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of share that experience.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great opportunity. And by the way, I'd like to preface this whole conversation that saying that even though I've been in the field for a pretty long time, I don't think anyone here is going to argue that, right, based on the objective number of years. But having said that, I'm not a licensed electrical engineer. I have colleagues who are, like Rick Miller,
Sure.
my very, very close friend and colleague. And, there are many people in the industry who are deep wells of information, like people like Steve Terry, for example. And in fact, listening to his podcast about emergency lighting is one of the things 2 years ago that spurred me to finally tackle this subject. And, I think people might be interested to hear that because I'm not a licensed electrical engineer, as many lighting professionals are not, it means that I don't sign off on anything that has to do with life safety. That
Sure.
means emergency lighting. So it's really ironic that I've spent so much time over the past couple of years getting into this subject. And the reason is that I thought, well, I'm out there all the time teaching, writing articles, talking about this stuff. So even though I'm not a licensed engineer, why shouldn't I learn this stuff anyway? It takes
Right.
time. It's a little complicated, right? We're all acknowledging that. None of us are saying this is incredibly easy, like boom, 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 5 minutes, you're done, right? But it's not rocket science, right? It's not quite at the level of rocket science, and it's important. And I actually also think it's pretty interesting. The irony is that the more I've learned about this in terms of the incredible minutiae of detail, the more interesting I actually think it is, and I'll explain a little bit why as we go along. But most recently, the biggest thing that I've done in terms of emergency lighting is to figure out how to explain it to other people, many of whom are also not licensed electrical engineers, some of whom are, by the way.
Yep.
So that's really important, because if I'm explaining to people who are signing off on it, what does that mean, right? It means they are legally responsible, and they have to really know for sure, right? So I had to know for sure. So I've gone down this very deep rabbit hole to really understand this as well as I could. I'm probably at 99.5%. As you know, there are aspects of the changes that are complex, and we could talk about it, and it may be that every one of us would have a slightly different understanding of what this specific verbiage means. I found that on a few occasions. I'm kind of surprised by it, but it's code verbiage. You know how that works, right?
Well, and that is pretty much what we talked about in this previous episode, which was a listener talk back where we had Mitch Hefter and David Butler come on and kind of respond to some comments made that were not really the clearest and cohesive to what is trying to be passed along as the message of, okay, these are the expectations. But the semantics when it comes to this sort of stuff really does become very important because of the fact that we're talking about life safety emergency requirements. And so,
Yes.
that's really the big thing about having people like you who are drilling into it, even though you're not the person stamping it. You can at least translate it to the rest of us and help us understand what exactly is being conveyed here. Because first of all, buying the UL 924 standard, which is the standard that most emergency override equipment when it comes to lighting controls adhered to, and reading through that standard is a real major process. Like, you're not gonna just do that as your Sunday reading. You're gonna actually spend a lot of time digging into it. And so having people like you who can instead just summarize or paraphrase or give us the gist of what is expected of us, because a lot of it doesn't necessarily even pertain to what we're doing when we're designing a lighting control system.
So, if I tell you a little bit about a recent experience I had with this, I think it'll be very, very informative, which was that I was actually in your neck of the woods in the Northeast teaching some classes on behalf of some utilities. There are, still utilities all over the country that are providing incentives for network lighting controls, and they're acknowledging that these are systems, and by definition, systems are complex, right? They're not shying away from that. So they're just saying, hey, we need to provide some education to our customers too. In the past few years, since 2022, which was the year that these changes took effect in UL, right, in May 6th, if I'm not mistaken, I've been able to convince some of these utilities that it would be a good idea to actually have classes either dedicated to emergency lighting, or where at least that's a major topic of like a full day class. So as you guys know from previous episodes that we've done, I've done a lot of hands-on classes. In fact, I always like to do hands-on work. I don't know how many people would want to listen to me talk for 6 hours straight. I'm not even sure my own mother would want to hear me talk for 6 hours straight. But it's also, it's boring for me. It's not interactive. It's just
Right.
one way. And really interesting things happen when you have actual equipment and there's actual interaction, not just from the part of, the quote unquote expert, but all these other people, right? Remember, in some of these classes, there are actual licensed electrical engineers, right? I'm not even a licensed electrical engineer. So just a month ago, up in Massachusetts, it turns out, purely coincidentally, it was a day of a freak snowstorm on April 4th, but 6 people did actually get there. It was freaky for me because I live in Honolulu, but that's okay. I grew up with snow. So they made it there, and that was cool. And that was really great, actually. So we worked with some of the equipment that I've used in the previous days, which were kind of introductory classes, where I specifically chose not to demonstrate the use of like an emergency rated controller, because I thought, well, I'm reserving this for that last day where we have an advanced level class. So the people who came to that knew that that was going to be a big topic. And the only reason the class was as small as it was probably just because of this freak snowstorm. But having said that, because it was a small group, we were able to do a lot of interesting things with the actual equipment. So we spent more than the time that I had allotted on this because it's such a big deal and people really want to understand it. And I think they thought, hey, this guy's got actual emergency equipment here. I'm going to ask all the questions I want, right? Which actually was great. It was really great. So I'll give you a really quick rundown of what happened. Um, I have a controller for a network lighting control system that in the past has been UL 924 rated and relied on a couple of different things to activate, which is, first of all, an automatic transfer switch flipping. So you'd have a momentary loss of power. And that's one of the signals that the controller took to say we're in an emergency condition. And the other thing is that if the server slash gateway is wired to normal power, and normal power goes down, then of course you'd lose the signal back to the gateway. So those are the two things that this particular system used to say, hey, we're in an emergency, and because we're wired to the emergency panel, sorry, now it's normal slash emergency,
Yep.
turn on and bypass the dimming circuit. And now, as you guys know, and I don't know, people haven't listened to these episodes before, they won't know this. The recent change says that you have to do something else. That's not adequate anymore. You also have to monitor normal power, because normal power doesn't normally go to those fixtures. There's no way for that device to do that. So now there are different methods, and they're pretty interesting. And even without having a fire alarm control panel, I was able to simulate that by using jumpers in the system to basically simulate that and set a contact closure in the system to be normally closed. It's actually a variable you can set. And then we opened it, and sure enough, the lights came on, not to full, but to 10%, because we programmed it to come on to 10%. That was amazing, because I had never seen it before. I knew that you could do it, and I knew that it was now legal based on the new UL 924 requirements, but I had never seen it. And even though I knew about it, I'm like, wow, like it was just incredible to see it, right? I'm like, wow, this is a legal method of providing emergency lighting. This is a new thing. It's a brand new thing. I've never seen this in my career, right? It was amazing.
Well, and this is kind of a callback to that conversation. It's not that UL 924 changed. It's that
Right.
NEC changed and required more of the emergency
Right.
override.
Right.
So
I'm glad you said that. Right.
it's a
NFPA,
shorthand that
not-
we love to use just internally
right.
in like people who
Right.
talk
I
about
just made
controls
that
all the
same
time.
mistake.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, let's like, for
Right.
other
It's
people who
NFPA,
don't
not.
understand the nuances here,
Right.
this is what's happening. But
Right.
back to your point, um, what's really fascinating about this is that, lighting can be put to a lower intensity level. So, say for instance, it's 0 to 10, and the lowest output is 10%. And so when you send the signal saying, hey, we've lost a normal power, we're now on emergency power, go to 10%. What's really interesting about this is the fact that you don't need to have every fifth fixture be emergency. You can have every fixture be emergency and still not drain the generator,
Right.
because
Right.
you could even in some cases be using less power by doing it that way than you would if you did every fifth fixture going
You
to full
might.
output.
Right. And I'm guessing that you guys, as fellow lighting professionals, would agree with me when I say that probably most lighting professionals would prefer to focus on uniformity as opposed to absolute, average levels. I've never been as anywhere near as concerned about absolute levels as I have about uniformity. I think that's
Yeah.
normal, right?
Mhm.
So, in fact, one of the things that I've learned to do as an educator, and I've been doing it for so long, I'm reasonably skilled at it, is that I'm not just going to sit there and explain like, okay, well, the code changed, the standard changed, now you could do this, et cetera, et cetera. I'm also trying to figure out why, right? Like people are going to say, oh, okay, it changed. Why?
Right.
What's the point? What's the benefit? Right. So that's exactly the kind of scenario that I've thought about. In fact, I'll even back up 7 years. 7 years ago, I was in Long Beach, California, giving a talk for IES Long Beach section or LA section. I can't remember. And Chip Israel, who happens to live in Long Beach, was sitting in the front row. He was a former president of IES. And, he needed credits. He thought, hey, Steve's a great guy. Let me come and hear his talk. And was talking about lighting control systems in general, but he actually asked that exact question. He said, wow, now that systems are almost all LED, the loads are so much lower, why can't we
Mhm.
just turn on all the lights in the facility? But, I don't recall if he said, why can't we turn on all the lights in the facility to a dimmed level? Because remember that historically, emergency bypass stuff would bypass the controls. That was a crucial
Yep.
element of them, right? But now that the NFPA 101, NEC, now that that stuff has changed and allows this, it is possible to do it. Having said that, there's some wrinkles that I'm not necessarily at 100% clarity about, pursuant to what we were talking about before, and I'll mention one. During this research, this really deep dive 2 years ago, once this change came into play, I had conversations with some very, very well-known, well-respected people in the industry about the fact that you could now, in theory, do this. And one of the things that some people said to me is, well, if you do that, you're going to have to get that, tested under those exact conditions. And I thought, well, who's going to do that? Like, we know the equipment can allow you to dim, but is it telling you that you can only dim to a certain level? Let's say 25%? No, right? There's nothing in the system. And anyway, what would that mean anyway? Because in any given space, what actual level would that provide, and what is that relative to the requirements listed in NFPA 101? So the inference is, well, that's going to be part of the testing procedure. Well, there's no way to do that, right? That's not really logical. So this sort of brings up, this is kind of like Brave New World, right? But at any rate, going back to what you said before, just to reinforce that, yeah, I actually used an example which is probably a little exaggerated, but I said, let's say you have an incredibly long corridor, and every 10th fixture in that corridor was on at full, right? Now, every single fixture could be on at 10%, and
Yep.
presumably you have the same load on the generator. From
Right.
a practical standpoint, that's really great, right? Hey, we're not increasing the load on a generator, but we have much more uniformity, right?
Yep.
Um, but again, these questions of, well, okay, is that okay to have those all of them on at 10% versus one here and one here on?
Mhm.
I know that we know automatically the uniformity would be different. It would automatically be better if they're all on. That's the
Right.
one thing
Sure.
we know for sure. We don't have to do any
Right. Well,
calculation to know that.
and just to clarify, the uniformity we're talking about is the emergency egress, which in
Right.
NEC is
Right.
40 to
Not
1.
normally.
And so, 40 to 1 is a fairly drastic ratio. I mean, typically with good
Oh yeah.
lighting design, you want to have a 1 to 2 ratio, maybe a 1 to 3 ratio. But 40 to
Right.
1, that's crazy. And so,
It's crazy.
you're going to be going through these pockets of light and dark. Whereas if you have all of the fixtures on at 10%, you're really not going to have that same pocketed effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Steve, I have a question for you. When you're working
Shoot.
through this stuff and you're working on trainings, how do you differentiate with people the difference between emergency and life safety? Because this is something that we run into a lot where the AHJ will walk in on the site, regardless of who that is, and say that under an alarm condition, be that a fire alarm or an intruder or whatever that alarm condition is, they want the lights to go to X scene, which may or may not be the same as life safety based on generator and all this. And so how do you, because that's a very fine distinction between emergency and life safety, but we constantly as as a group all say emergency. So how do you differentiate through that as you work through trainings with people?
That is a really great question, and I'm so happy that you brought that up because I might have forgotten to address that. In the realm of this entire subject, which is complex, as none of us are shying away from the complexity of this. That's a really big issue, and I think it's becoming more. I think it's becoming bigger and more important to talk about that now, especially because all these new methodologies are now in place and new standards, NFPA, and so forth. Um, just as an example of that, that might help to explain why this is such a big deal. Let me just say for the viewers that there is a system that I've used in classes. By the way, I've probably used 7 or 8 different systems in hands-on classes now. So, I just get the equipment, I fool around with it, I figure out how it works. Again, not rocket science, right? But you have to fool around with it to learn it. In one of the systems that I've used a lot in recent years, in fact, the system we used a month ago, when you have an emergency controller installed somewhere, then there's an option that appears in the software. If you don't have an emergency controller, then that option won't appear. It's kind of funny. Normally you would think, oh, well, it'll just be here and maybe it would be grayed out. They literally take it out of the software for display unless you have the actual emergency controller. So to learn about this, you have to have an emergency controller or you'll never find that option in the software. When you open that option, what it actually says is, one of the things that you have to say is this for a power loss, a fire, or security? So as you just said, those could be different things, right? Let's say for sake of argument, during a power loss, let's say, at least in the past, we might say, okay, we want to force lights on to full, at least the lights designated as EN. What about a security incident? I'm sorry to have to use these words in a lighting podcast, but let's say there's an active shooter. Well, in an active shooter situation, maybe you want all the lights to turn off, right? I don't know, I'm not a security expert, but let's say you do. That's completely the opposite, right? So it doesn't actually change the operation in this particular system that I use. And I think the reason that they have those in there is probably because they're anticipating that at some future date, they'll say, hey, if you designate it as a security incident, you can set up a different preset scene to do something else, like turn all the lights off, right? That's not the same preset scene, but in this particular system, there's literally only one basically scene that you can set for quote unquote emergency. So it really highlights the fact that this is new and it's evolving. And I'm not sure what else I could really, say about it other than that it's kind of like a moving target and I have to keep, I keep getting exposed to new things just like this. It's like, wow, if you didn't have this emergency controller, you'd never know it. Literally, it's not even shown in the software until you install a controller in a fixture. So it really shows you, I don't know what you guys think, I'd be curious to hear your opinions, but to me, based on the stuff that I've been doing, it's emerging. It's emerging in the technology as well as in the codes and standards.
Yeah, totally. And I think that that's a really good point, and that was also something that we were talking about in this previous episode, where this is an ongoing conversation that is always evolving, and we'll probably even watch this episode 10 years from now and go, oh, geez, that's no longer
Right.
accurate.
Absolutely. For sure.
So,
Absolutely.
but I think the core focus of this is that we are protecting people's lives and making sure
Right.
that under the right conditions we are providing illumination that is adequate to navigate whatever it is. So, for instance, you're talking about active shooter situation where you don't necessarily want to have floodlights everywhere showing exactly where people can be found. At the same time, life safety really is a term that means something in the NFPA requirements.
Right.
And so life safety really is when you're talking about if the life is dependent upon the illumination, and so we really need to provide a safe path of egress for those people. But that's not going to be the same illumination condition for an emergency versus a power loss versus a fire.
May not be.
So having that capacity to reprogram and change based on the needs, I think that really is a good choice. It does kind of become challenging when we're dealing with the semantics of it because of how precise you have to be. And
Right.
that's one of the major
And
reasons
deliberate.
why people throw their hands up when talking about emergency or life safety or any of these topics, because it becomes, well, no, that's not really the correct. And it's like, well, you know what I'm trying to say, right? And it's like, yes, but precision is really important here.
Right. And Ron, it sounds like you've dealt with this on the job a lot, just based on asking
It
the
is
question,
something
right?
something we deal with very frequently, right? So we work in a lot of high schools, a lot of theaters, a lot of auditoriums. So it's very common that we have to have an emergency scene for typically fire alarm, right? Where the AHJ, typically, in this case, typically the fire inspector, but not always, will come in and say, under an alarm condition, we want the lights to go to full or this set level so that the firefighters can come in and do what they need to and not come into a dark space. But those are not, that event is not the same as the life safety event. So we have to have very clear conversations on site that when we're talking about life safety events versus an emergency condition, and I try to say it life safety event versus emergency condition. I try to train myself to say it that way, so try to differentiate
Yeah.
them as much as possible for people, so that I can be clear in what we're talking about, because there is such a drastic difference. Like, no, only X amount of fixtures are on the generator, so we can only physically turn on these lights under this life safety condition. But when this alarm goes off, I can do anything you want as long as there's power to the building.
Right.
And I think what you're talking about, Ron, and this is the disclaimer moment of none of this is legal advice. As
Right.
Steve mentioned, we're not professionals. We don't stamp drawings. We're definitely go to a professional and pay their fee to get professional advice. But as far as that particular requirement, I believe that's a local requirement to the Massachusetts emergency code requirements, and so that cropped up over the last few years as a requirement. And so older theaters need to upgrade to have this new requirement met. But again, it's to Steve's point that ever evolving. We're just seeing these changes, and so even further, the inspectors also need to learn these things as well.
So to elaborate on that just slightly, because it's here. I'll further the arc of this conversation a little bit. So first thing that I'd actually like to say before I forget is that I think I would have thought that there would have been more standardization of terminology about these kinds of things in, for example, NFPA 101.
Hmm.
because like that's just like the IAS handbook is the Bible for light levels, right? NFPA
Yep.
101 is kind of like the Bible for life safety stuff, right? So somewhere I would have really thought that these things would have been somewhat more clearly defined by now. These distinctions between, as I said, like just based on based on working with this one of the systems that I've worked with in classes. Oh, look at that! They're distinguishing right there in their software between, power loss,
Yep.
fire, security. Those could all three be different things. Now to
Yes.
go farther, and I believe I told this story before, but in case people haven't heard that, um, one of the things that is theoretically possible even right now is imagine. I'm going to give you a scenario that's kind of interesting. Let's say that you have a project where you have an LLLC deployment, so luminaire level lighting controls, every fixture's got sensors, and let's say that all of those fixtures also had temperature sensors built in, not just photosensor and ox sensor. Some systems currently do have that. Imagine if, based on the real-time reading of the temperature part, if during an actual fire, if the lighting system could actually tell where the fire was
Mm.
in the building.
Mm.
Imagine that it might decide to not activate certain lights that might be near or leading to an exit, which was near where the active fire was, or at least a lot of heat, right? That's theoretically possible right now.
All right, welcome back. We just had a little bit of some technical difficulty, so we're going to hop right back into the conversation. Non sequitur, I guess. But, ultimately, one of the things personally that I wanted to chat about was also going back to what you can do with these sorts of applications is reducing the number of circuits on an emergency system or on a system in general, because you no longer need to have two parallel circuits running, feeding normal fixtures and then normal emergency fixtures, if you just give all of them the ability to be on the emergency.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's going back to the story I told you about what Chip
Right.
Israel asked me. The idea, I think that's part of what motivated his question, is to say, hey, if we can turn them all on, then we don't need to distinguish between normal and versus emergency circuitry, right?
Right.
I'm sure that's part of what motivated that question. Yeah.
I will say though, one concern that I potentially have there, and I'm sure other engineers may have the same concern, is how does that affect inrush current, right? All these LEDs have drivers, so if everything's from a completely cold environment and nothing's on, what is the potential inrush do? So while the load overall is lower, what is the inrush to power every driver and every fixture?
Geez, who would have thought that inrush, we'd still be talking about inrush after the days of CFLs? But we are, right? Because right. So yeah, actually, you could probably make a case to say that regardless of what the load type is, that you always have to be concerned about it, right? Yeah, if you're talking about, if you're talking about turning, let's say you want to turn on all of the fixtures in any space to 10% as opposed to 100, it's a fairly small fraction of the load. But yeah, you're still, if you're coming on from zero, it's still a big, it's still a lot of load, even if they're all 10%. Yeah. So
Well,
that's a technical issue that the field will have to start fooling around with. Yeah.
and I would be curious to see, what the response is to being a dimmed output versus a full output, because of the fact that LEDs have such a significant spike of inrush at a very small amount of time. But, it's a question of,
Yeah.
okay, you're technically at a dim state, so does it energize at that dim state, or does it energize to full and then go, oh, I'm dimmed, and then jump down? And as a result, I think to your point, Ron, you may end up tripping breakers, or you may end up causing damage to equipment
Yeah.
if the inrush is too significant. But
Geez,
yeah,
it reminds me of using chokes, on circuits. It's amazing. I mean, we're going back a long ways, right, to bring up stuff like that. But it's same kind of issue, and that's
well,
getting into a level of technical detail that I'm not, equipped to
Well,
answer that question.
just to
Curious.
not to put you on the spot or anything, but do you mind explaining what a choke is to our listeners who might not know what that is?
I would actually nominate you to do that. I probably could do a pretty good job, but to be honest, I
Fair
think
enough.
actually you're probably a better person to do it.
Well, so I mean, we still use these in theater actually, especially with full 20 amp breaker dimmers, and basically a choke is just a way of preventing power from just going from 0 to 100 all at once and just blowing through all of your equipment. A choke slows it down, and so a common choke example would be a circle of copper that is coiled around. Um, and the point is that the electricity goes through that coil and it finds resistance along that coil so that it doesn't immediately spike. And so in an LED application, a choke would be for the same purpose of just reducing that inrush that would happen as a result of you energizing something instantaneously. And I don't disagree with the theory here. I'm curious what some of our industrial designer colleagues would say about how much that would increase the cost of a fixture if they had to add a choke to every single fixture or to a circuit. But I think, stuff like that, yeah, we are going to have to find solutions to these issues where we have new technology being demanded to function in new ways.
Right. It's right. Exactly. That's what I was just thinking about. Because with a lot of these things, it's very easy to say, in theory, we could do this. In theory, we could do that.
Right.
But then when you're dealing with the actual equipment, what actually happens? Right.
Right.
So there are a lot of things like this that, geez, I mean, for as much as I know about this, and I know a fair amount about this, there are a lot of technical details that I don't. I don't, design controllers for network lighting control systems for a living. I'm not an integrated circuit board designer, right? That's not what I do. I'd have to, geez, I mean, that's a whole, that's years worth of knowledge that I do not have, right? But it's really, but because we're talking about life safety, so as a reminder for the younger viewers of the podcast, there was a time when early on, after the introduction of CFLs, in particular compact fluorescent lamps, that they started tripping breakers all over the place because of this inrush issue. And before people started to get a handle on that, that just happened all over the place. And then they realized, like, oh, we have associated inrush current. Well, I mean, that's not something that a lighting, that's in the electrical realm. A lot of lighting people don't even, like, hey, what is that anyway, right? But hey, it affects this. So, fortunately, they kind of figured it out, right? But so, yeah, so here it's the reason it's critical is because we're talking about it potentially affecting life safety, right? It's one thing if you don't get 30 foot candles on your desk in an office, right? Or if you don't get a minimum of 1 foot candle on the path of egress under normal conditions. But it's another thing if you don't have light that you need in an emergency condition. That's a different issue, right?
Right.
That's why it's important. Right. Yeah. So
And
that's why UL has said, yeah, in theory, there's all sorts of wild things that could potentially be done to help people exit a building in an emergency, but we're going to hold back a little bit for now because we're relying on a lot of complex factors here, and we want to just take it slow. And I think that's, I'm excited about any cutting edge technology, but I think it's a very understandable decision that they want to, hold. That they don't want to go crazy with it all at once.
yeah, and I think ultimately there's a conversation going on between a lot of different groups. It's not just UL, it's NFPA, it's these other groups that have these, the term the constellation of emergency controls gets tossed around when getting to this high level because you're really dealing with a lot of different groups, and they're all trying to allow for this inroad of here's the solution that's going to work. We don't want to restrict innovation, but we want to just make sure that innovation is done in a way that supports the goal here. And it's not just, you get a widget and that widget fails and then somebody loses a life because of that.
So, one of the things that is not really a code issue per se, but that I think is very interesting to have witnessed, is how effective it is to give people actual equipment and let them fool around with it and see how much better their comprehension is of what this
Hmm.
stuff is about and how it works, as opposed to just telling them. I
Right.
could have a PowerPoint, I could record something, even these, interviews are great. It's still, it will never take the place of just bringing equipment to a class location and saying, guys, here's kind of the way this works. I can show you this diagrammatically. And by the way, I have some of the actual equipment. Let's actually put it together. There's just nothing like it. I mean, even for me, imagine that I've been doing this for a long time, and I was completely blown away when we opened that jumper and simulated the activation of a fire alarm signal, and the fixtures dimmed to 10%. I was I was trying to be restrained. I didn't want to seem like a lunatic, but in my head, I was blown away. I'm like, this is the first time in 44 years I've ever seen that, and it's
Yeah.
legal right
Right.
now. And these
Yeah.
guys, I can tell you, they were amazed by, that was only one of, they had never seen any of the other things either, right? They were like, whoa, and they really understand it pretty well now. And I think that there's a need, this isn't the code side, right? The code,
Hmm.
writing side. I've been in California for a long time, Title 24, we all know what that's like. But this is different. This is the other side of it, where it's like, okay, we can write this stuff all day long. We could have experts write the stuff all day long, but actually implementing it, like Ron, the stories that you're telling us about actual projects and this complexity of, life safety versus emergency, like that may, people might, if you just said that to me in passing, I might say, well, isn't that the same thing? Sounds like it's the same thing, right? But in fact, maybe it's not, right? Or maybe
Yeah,
somebody's going to
right.
interpret it a little differently than somebody else. That's why it's really important that we do this work, to talk about it like we're doing here, and to do anything else we can. And all I know is that the most fun I've ever had is to do hands-on classes. I'd much rather watch people fool around with this stuff themselves under my supervision, so they don't smoke. I tell people in classes that the motto of the class is not smoke 'em if you got 'em. That's not the motto of the class, right? So, of course, it's under my supervision. I'm going to make sure they don't miswire something and blow a whole driver or something. But
Yep.
seeing them do this and seeing the questions that they ask, I can tell you one of the classes that I did last year in the Midwest, in the middle, really in the middle of the Midwest, literally in the middle of cornfields, in a building, but in the middle of cornfields. One of the guys who came to one of these classes happened to be the facilities manager for a regional hospital network. So, those were probably relatively small hospitals in a relatively small region. But even so, hospitals are never less than like maybe 1 million square feet, right? There's no hospital that's less than like 1 million square feet. And he was responsible for several of these. Once I demonstrated this emergency controller, whoa,
Hmm.
he had questions, and I spent a solid 30 minutes talking to him directly about emergency while everybody else was fooling around with occupancy settings and photo sensor target levels, right? Because that's the thing that he was most concerned about, because he's managing a hospital. So it really shows you, like, people really do want to know about this. And, it's not to scare people. My dad, who was an IBM salesperson his whole life, told me at a very early age that people are motivated by fear and greed.
Hmm.
That's kind of the age old thing, right? We all know
Right.
that. So my purpose is not to scare people, but hey, you know what? It scares me when I think that it's life safety. And I've been in buildings when alarms have gone off and seen that people don't know what to do, or
Right.
emergency stuff doesn't operate as it should. It's like, oh boy, guys, that's, by the way, that's another part of this whole issue that we haven't even touched on, is what happens if emergency stuff goes off. I live in a 45-story condo building here in downtown Honolulu, and the fire alarm actually went off one night while I was working on the emergency lighting content for a class 2 years ago. And I was one of literally 10 people who walked down the fire stairs. There's probably 1,000 people who live in this building. That has nothing to do with the emergency lights. It has nothing to do with the panels. It's simply a matter of people don't realize, like, hey, you hear the alarm, it means you walk down the fire stairs, guys.
Yeah.
That's why the smoke doors on the elevators close. It's what you're supposed
Right.
to do. So there are a lot of parts and pieces to this. We can, of course, only deal with the lighting part, right? But
Yeah.
we're
Well,
doing,
and
we're doing our best.
go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, I mean, hands-on, right, really is the best way to learn anything, right? It's like when people tell you, and I know this is tougher for probably some of the younger generation, physically writing something down, not typing it in your phone, physically writing something. There is science behind that tells you that it will help you remember that better than just typing it. And physically being hands-on with something is the same thing. If you can physically
Yeah.
see it and do it, you can read it in all the cut sheets and all the drawings and diagrams, but until you physically wire it, put it together, see how it operates, and see how it doesn't operate, or maybe doesn't do what you want it to, and you wire it the wrong way, you're not going to have a full understanding of how it works, and potentially what parts and pieces are really required. Because a lot of times what we see in the the cut sheets and stuff is very generic, and it may not be specific to your application. So there may be parts and pieces missing from what you need. So being able to be hands-on is really the best way to learn about the components and how they interact and what you need to be sure that you're putting together the proper system and you understand how it operates and what it should do.
Yes, and that's a really great point. And since you mentioned that, I'll just tell you very briefly a story I may have related before, where I worked on a demonstration project as a consultant to Lawrence Berkeley National Labs in the mid 2010s. And they installed 4 different systems in 4 quadrants of a really major corporate headquarters building in downtown Manhattan. And this was actually done on a retrofit basis because there was existing stuff there. I went there to observe the process of installation, at least at the beginning of the project. And what I saw is that the electricians, who were very smart guys, struggled originally because all they were supplied with were either standard cut sheets, which didn't always deal with the conditions they had, or in some cases, um, project-specific drawings, which were amazingly less clear than I would have expected. That's the way I'm going to put it for the sake of politics. But I was pretty amazed, I'll be honest. And one of the things that was most egregious that I saw was the way that they actually explained how the emergency would work. And I won't get into the gory details of it here because it would take quite a while to explain it. But I was pretty surprised. I thought, boy, you guys are being pretty casual. I appreciate that somebody created this drawing. But if I wasn't already an expert in this and I hadn't used that system in classes, which I had, I wouldn't really know what to connect to what and why you would do that. I thought, wow, you can't do that, guys. So
Mm-hmm.
part of the onus here, I don't want to sound schmucky about it, but part of the onus is on the manufacturers. They can just say, hey, if we want to ensure a successful deployment every time, in hopes that these people will use this equipment for the next project, well, we just have to provide this minimum stuff, including really clear drawings. If they have to
Yeah.
provide a project-specific drawing every time, then that's what they're going to have to do, at least for now. If at some point in the future there's enough standardization that we don't have to do that, that's fine. But right now, whoa, if you have
Yeah.
something that is, especially if it's going to impact life safety, you have to communicate it in a way that people will understand. And if you
Right.
can't, for whatever reason, you got to send somebody to job site at your expense. Like, we can't, it's the onus is not on us to try to figure it out like a Chinese puzzle, right?
Sure.
It's coming from you guys.
Well,
You got to tell us how it works,
totally. We're almost out of time here, so I want to wrap up what we've talked about here. I think this is all really great stuff and really helpful. Hopefully people listening are going to find this helpful to further understanding emergency. It is a complex web of information. And so the more we can do to simplify this and make it clearer to listeners, the better. But I mean, as far as lighting controls as from a UL 924 emergency standpoint, the expectations of how we've done it in the past, which is, all on, full on for the emergency lighting. There's been a change. It's not been in UL 924. It's been in NEC, but the expectation is that you don't have to do full on anymore. And as a result, that does kind of open up opportunities for new ways of doing emergency lighting. But kind of jumping ahead to the end of this conversation, just because you can doesn't mean that it's well documented and ready to go.
Right.
If you're going to be providing that on a project, you need to provide clear guidelines. And that's where sequence of operations, control intent narratives, thorough documentation really comes into play here. And so a lot of changes within the industry are created to support these kinds of initiatives outside of the industry, because of the fact that there is a lack of communication and clarity when it comes to these things. And you don't have to be an expert on emergency lighting or life safety lighting for you to use these devices or to provide a good solution, but you do have to think through what the expectations are. And having hands-on experience really is the gold standard when it comes to understanding expectations and running through. And even further, not just training for the lighting experts, but training for the end users, getting the end users to put their hands on this equipment, or at least facilities managers or people who are going to be making these decisions regarding the capabilities of these systems. I mean, we are a small niche, very small percentage of a project when it comes to the full brunt of if you're going to build a building from ground up. But we touch so many different aspects that are important and critical to the functionality of the building that we really do need to do a good amount of service to make sure that people are educated and understand what they're getting. I mean, if I went to somebody on the street and I said, how do you know that your building is compliant with UL 924 standards and NEC code requirements? They're going to look at me like I just said a bunch of gibberish. So, what is it that we're trying to convey here? And we love to roll up everything under the term UL 924 just for shorthand. And like I a listener pointed out to me and I pointed out to you, we got to do a better job of just going, okay, no, we're like, this is not where this exists. This is where this exists. But even further, maybe not even using the jargon, maybe finding a simpler way of just saying, when your power goes off, your lighting turns on, or something simple. But we as an industry need to come together and create those standards so that there's consistency throughout. And so, I think the onus, while yes, on the manufacturer to provide adequate documentation, especially installation instructions or cut sheets, it is also the onus on the application designer, such as a lighting controls designer or a lighting designer or an architect, to make sure that the documentation is clear enough when delivered to the contractor that they can go, oh, I see what they're trying to do here. And I think that is just a ubiquitous challenge throughout our industry with all players involved. We all need to do a better job and elevate ourselves with these kinds of communications. But having people such as yourself, Steve, really does improve that, because you go into the weeds, you deep dive, and then you come back, kind of, what is it? Prothesis, the Greek god, demigod who got the fire and brought it back to humans, and kind of Prometheus. That's what it is. Just, you didn't bring the sun, you didn't bring everything, but you just brought the torch and brought fire. So you helped.
Piece of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. What we need to do is we need to take that expertise and distill it so that everybody can understand it.
Agreed.
Awesome. Well, Steve, really,
Very well
thank you
said.
so much for coming on today. We really appreciate your time. And you're right. It may not be rocket science, but it certainly is complicated. And there's a lot to it. And the more that all of us are educated, the better we all are for it. And the easier it is to have conversations together as a group, with the AHJ, with the other parties on site, especially if you are someone who is on site, whether you're a rep, a distributor, a dealer, it doesn't matter. If you're on site with this equipment at all, the more educated you are, the easier it is to have those conversations. And importantly, I know we talked about this in the last episode, but please pay attention to what version of the code is being used on your project, because it has such a drastic implication on how the system is designed and implemented. And if you're not sure, what version of the code is on that project, get the information, make sure that you're working with the appropriate parties to design the correct system for that project. There's just so much to it. So it's not rocket science, but it is very complicated, and we don't want to, like I said, we don't want to shy away from that. So Steve, really, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you trying to encapsulate all of this for our listeners. And I'll just take a minute to remind everyone, today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. We've got all of our episodes, including the one we were talking about in this episode. We've got a news feed, a merch store if you want to support the podcast, a list of trainings that are coming up that Ron or I are doing, as well as our Council on Lighting Control Startup and Integration if you want to get involved. Check it all out. Otherwise, thanks for listening to us. And Steve, thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. I almost forgot to thank our sponsor for this episode who allowed us to make this possible. Before I thank you, Steve, let me talk about MW Connect, who previously was known as McWong. MWConnect.us. Check out their website. They have a lot of great information. They've been in this industry for over 40 years, and they really have a lot of great support. Per what Steve was talking about, documentation, having the supporting information, they've got it. So check out their website, reach out to your local rep for MW Connect. If you're unfamiliar with the product, get those hands-on demonstrations with the products, because if you don't know it, get your rep into your office with the product to showcase it to you, because it's really good stuff. And they've been involved in this industry for so long. They know the ins and outs. They know what you need for your projects, and they're constantly staying up to date with these, such as the ability to do UL 924 control and override. They've got that solution, and they also have award-winning Bluetooth mesh technology that's really at the ready. So check them out. But until then, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for joining us. And Steve, really appreciate you joining us. This was a great conversation.